It was a Sunday morning in Richmond, Virginia, and Jefferson Davis was sitting in his usual pew at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, listening to a sermon he would never finish hearing. A sexton walked down the aisle toward him, carrying a folded piece of paper. Every head in that congregation turned to watch. Nobody knew what the note said, but everybody understood, in the way a room understands a funeral before anyone speaks, that something had gone terribly wrong. Davis read it. He stood up, and he walked out of the church without saying a single word to the people around him. What that note told him was that Petersburg had fallen, and what happened over the next 7 days would be one of the fastest collapses of a nation-sized military power in modern history. Not weeks, not months, 7 days. An army that had survived 4 brutal years of war, that had beaten back invasions, that had buried tens of thousands of its own men and kept fighting anyway, came apart so quickly that the men living through it could barely process what was happening to them as it happened. If you enjoy historical stories like this one, don't forget to click the subscribe button and join us for more. If you think you understand how fast the Confederacy fell after Petersburg, I promise you, you don't. Because this isn't a story about a battle being lost. It's a story about a structure that had already rotted from the inside for years, finally giving way all at once and then simply falling faster than anyone standing inside it could keep up with. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how a war that took 4 years and 600,000 lives to build up to ended in a single week. Let's go back 9 months to the Siege of Petersburg. For 9 months and 18 days, Ulysses Grant's army had been pressing against Robert E. Lee's defensive lines outside the city. Through the summer heat, through the fall, through a winter so miserable that men on both sides were freezing in open trenches, Grant kept doing the same simple, relentless thing. He kept stretching the line. Lee's forces were spread across roughly 40 miles of fortifications, and every week Grant pushed that line a little further west, forcing Lee to spread his shrinking army even thinner to cover it. Lee understood exactly what this meant. Early in the siege, he had already told Jefferson Davis plainly that if Grant ever managed to cut the last rail line supplying Petersburg from the south, there would be no more fighting for the city. There would be no orderly retreat. The army would have to run. That moment came on April 1st at a crossroads called Five Forks. Union cavalry under Phil Sheridan, backed by infantry under Gouverneur Warren, tore into the Confederate right flank late in the afternoon and rolled it up completely. Fitz Lee's cavalry and George Pickett's division, the same Pickett whose name is forever tied to the doomed charge at Gettysburg, were shattered. And here's the detail that still stuns historians. Pickett wasn't even with his men when the attack started. He was several miles away at a shad bake, a fish cookout, hosted by a fellow general. He could hear the gunfire rolling in from the west. By the time he rode hard back to his own lines, they were already dissolving underneath him. It was one of the worst command failures of the entire war, and it cost the Confederacy the South Side Railroad, the last working supply line into Petersburg. Grant didn't wait. The next morning, before the sun was even up on April 2nd, Union forces smashed through the Confederate fortifications at multiple points simultaneously. At a small earthen defense called Fort Gregg, a few hundred Confederate soldiers held a position they knew was already lost, buying time they understood would be measured in minutes, not hours. They held long enough for Lee to begin organizing an evacuation. Then the fort fell, and the men still alive inside it surrendered or died where they stood. That same morning, on the western edge of the collapsing line, one of Lee's most essential generals was killed. His name was Ambrose Powell Hill. If that name doesn't mean much to you, here's why it should. Back in September of 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, Hill's division arrived on the battlefield at the last possible moment and saved the Confederate army from total destruction. For the rest of the war, his troops set the pace for how fast the Army of Northern Virginia could move. He had been sick for much of the Petersburg siege, worn down by months of trench life, and on the morning of April 2nd, he rode out toward the fighting on a horse named Chestnut, straight into Union soldiers who had already broken through the line. He was shot at close range. He was 40 years old. When Lee was told, he wept, and he said something to an aide that tells you everything about what was coming. He said he was glad Hill hadn't lived to see what was about to happen. Think about that for a second. Robert E. Lee, on the morning of April 2nd, was already bracing for something he could barely stand to face himself. In Richmond, the Confederate government had known for months that this day might come, and they had made preparations. Treasury gold was loaded onto rail cars. Government archives were boxed up. Departments were kept on standby to evacuate at a moment's notice. But preparations always look cleaner on paper than they do in the panic of the actual emergency. Cabinet officers ran for the trains. Clerks hauled boxes of documents through streets that were already filling with the sound of artillery to the east and south. The government of the Confederate States of America loaded itself onto rail cars and fled south toward Danville, Virginia, with Jefferson Davis still believing, or at least still insisting, that the war could go on. And then Richmond began to burn. It wasn't an accident, not at first. Confederate officials made the deliberate decision to torch the city's warehouses so the advancing Union Army couldn't seize the tobacco, cotton, and military supplies stored inside them. What they hadn't accounted for was the wind and the bone-dry April air, and the simple, terrifying fact that fire, once it finds momentum, doesn't ask permission to keep spreading. The warehouse fires jumped to the surrounding blocks. The bridges over the James River were set alight right on schedule, and then the Confederate arsenal caught fire and began exploding, sending shells and metal fragments raining across the city through the early morning hours. By the time the sun rose on April 3rd, a huge portion of the Confederate capital was burning, and there was no one left in any position of authority to stop it. The people who remained in the city, the poor with nowhere to flee, the elderly, the enslaved people held there, watched their capital destroy itself from the inside. Some stood in the streets and watched. Some looted the warehouses before the flames reached them. Some did both at once. And when Union troops marched into Richmond on April 3rd, some of the very first soldiers through the streets were black Union soldiers. That was not an accident of timing. To the people watching from doorways and windows, it meant something that no speech or newspaper could have captured. 2 days later, Abraham Lincoln himself came to Richmond by boat. He walked through the burned district surrounded by only a small detail of sailors, and he sat down in Jefferson Davis's own chair inside the Confederate Executive Mansion. Crowds of newly freed black residents recognized him and pressed forward, and they were not held back. Lincoln shook their hands. He let children touch his coat. Every person present understood exactly what that moment meant. On every level, it was operating on at once. But the war wasn't over, because Lee's army was still in the field. The Army of Northern Virginia, roughly 28,000 men by the time they cleared the Petersburg lines, was moving west toward a small rail junction called Amelia Courthouse, where Lee had arranged for food and supplies to be waiting. His plan was to resupply there, then swing south toward Danville, link up with Joseph Johnston's army still fighting Sherman down in North Carolina, and combine the two remaining Confederate forces into something that could still, mathematically, keep the war alive. Lee knew the odds were long, but it was the only move he had left. The retreat itself was chaos. Men who had spent 9 straight months living in trenches were now marching through the night, carrying whatever equipment they could hold on to and abandoning the rest. Horses were exhausted past the point of usefulness. Wagons broke down in the middle of the road and jammed up the entire column behind them. Units lost contact with each other in the dark and had to find their way forward by sound alone, following the footsteps of the men ahead. These soldiers had marched hard before. Nobody who had survived Stonewall Jackson's campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley back in 1862 thought a difficult march was anything new. But those earlier marches had been made by men who had eaten and who believed they were moving toward something. This march was different. This one felt like running away. And they were being hunted the entire time. Phil Sheridan's cavalry harassed the column from the south, cutting at the supply wagons, picking off stragglers, blocking side roads. The main Union army pushed hard behind them from the north. Lee's men were moving, yes, but movement without a destination isn't a strategy, and the soldiers in the ranks knew it. Some men simply sat down by the roadside and stopped. Others deserted, not out of cowardice, but out of a cold, exhausted arithmetic, weighing the odds of a column marching west against the odds of just going home to the farm they'd left 3 years earlier. Officers tried to hold their units together and watched them thin out anyway. The roads behind the retreating army filled up with everything an exhausted force sheds when it's running out of reasons to keep carrying it. Broken equipment, spent ammunition boxes, personal letters, photographs left behind in the mud. On April 4th, Lee's lead units finally reached Amelia Courthouse. And the food wasn't there. This single detail tells you more about the true state of the Confederacy than almost anything else in this entire story. Lee had sent specific written orders for rations to be waiting at that junction. Instead, the rail cars were packed with artillery ammunition for guns his army barely had enough horses left to pull. Somewhere in the collapsing bureaucracy of a government that was simultaneously fleeing south on trains and trying to run a military campaign across 100 miles of Virginia, the food orders had simply gotten lost. Lee lost an entire day sending men out into the countryside to forage for supplies. And after 4 years of war, there was almost nothing left out there to find. He resumed the march on April 5th, a full day behind schedule, leading men who had now gone without real food since the night of April 2nd. And then came April 6th, at a place called Sailor's Creek, the moment when the word collapse stops being a figure of speech and becomes something you can point to on a map. The Confederate column had already fragmented from the previous day's chaotic march, split apart by bad roads, broken wagons, and constant harassment from Union forces on both flanks. The rear section of the column, roughly a quarter of Lee's entire remaining army, including several of his most senior generals, fell behind and lost contact with the main body entirely. Union cavalry and infantry closed in on them from multiple directions at once. 8,000 Confederate soldiers were captured in a single afternoon. 6 Confederate generals surrendered, men who had commanded troops through the 7 days, through Chancellorsville, through the wilderness. They weren't captured because they'd been broken in battle. They were captured because they'd been outmaneuvered by an army that still had food in its wagons and horses that hadn't been starving for 4 straight days. Lee watched the survivors stream back toward him from a hillside, and he said the line that shows up in nearly every serious account of this campaign, not because it's elegant, but because it's the most honest thing he said the entire war. He asked, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" It hadn't. Not quite yet. Roughly 15,000 men were still capable of fighting. But 15,000 starving, exhausted soldiers, with their supply lines already destroyed, could not punch through the Union forces now gathering ahead of them, near a place called Appomattox Station, where Sheridan's cavalry had already arrived first and seized the 4 supply trains that represented the very last food Lee's army had been counting on. Grant had already started writing to Lee by this point, telling him plainly that continued resistance was pointless, that more men dying on both sides would accomplish nothing that couldn't be settled through surrender. His terms had never changed. Officers would keep their sidearms. Soldiers would go home. No prison, no prosecution. On the morning of April 9th, Confederate forces under John Gordon and Fitzhugh Lee made one final push, attacking what looked like a thin screen of Union cavalry blocking their escape route south. For a moment, it worked. Then Union infantry came up in overwhelming numbers behind that cavalry screen, sealing off every road out of Appomattox in every direction that mattered. Lee sent word that he wanted to meet. That afternoon, the two generals sat down together in the front parlor of a house belonging to a man named Wilmer McLean in the tiny village of Appomattox Courthouse. There is a strange, almost poetic detail buried here. McLean had moved his family to this quiet corner of Virginia specifically to get away from the war. His previous home, near Manassas, had been used as a Confederate headquarters during the very first major battle of the war, and a Union artillery shell had landed directly in his kitchen fireplace. He picked his family up and moved as far from the fighting as he reasonably could. And 4 years later, the war found him anyway, and ended in his own front parlor. Lee arrived in his finest uniform with a dress sword at his side. That same morning, he had told an aide that he would rather die than face the humiliation of surrender. And then he went anyway. That gap between what he said and what he actually did might be the single most accurate window into who Robert E. Lee really was. A man whose sense of honor demanded a certain kind of performance, even in a moment when that performance served no practical purpose at all. He was 60 years old, and by every account, he looked every year of it. But here's the part most people don't know. The story doesn't actually end at Appomattox. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. Joseph Johnston surrendered his own army to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26th. Jefferson Davis was finally captured in Georgia on May 10th, having fled south with a shrinking escort the entire way, still somehow performing the conviction that the cause wasn't finished. He was caught near dawn, wrapped in a shawl his wife had thrown over his shoulders against the cold. His enemies would later use that shawl to claim he'd tried to escape disguised as a woman. His supporters spent years disputing it, but neither version changes what the image itself communicated to the country. A president in flight, wrapped in borrowed cloth, run to ground in a Georgia swamp. And even after all of that, the Confederacy still didn't fully end. Stand Watie, commanding Confederate forces among the Cherokee Nation out in Indian Territory, didn't surrender until June 23rd, a full 10 weeks after Appomattox. A Confederate raiding ship called the CSS Shenandoah, operating out in the Pacific Ocean, didn't even receive word that the war was over until August, and kept operating for months after that until its crew finally sailed all the way to Liverpool, England, to formally surrender to British authorities in November. The Confederacy didn't collapse all at once, not really. It unraveled outward from its center, dying by degrees in places the center had already given up on and abandoned. The men fighting those last scattered engagements, refusing those final surrenders, weren't being irrational. They were simply working with information that traveled slowly, holding on to a faith that somewhere further south the cause might still be standing. It was the exact same faith that had carried that army from the earliest days of the war all the way to the trenches outside Petersburg. By the time news of Appomattox finally reached the last holdouts, it didn't land as a shock. It landed as confirmation of something most of them had already felt coming for a long, long time. But it all started on an ordinary Sunday morning in a church in Richmond, when a sexton walked down an aisle carrying a folded note, and a man in a pew stood up and walked out into a city that had less than 48 hours left before it began to burn. 7 days. That's all it took to bring down an organization that had taken 4 years and 600,000 lives to build and defend. And when the end finally came, it didn't come slowly. It came in a week.